What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we're taking a look at our Week 4 waiver wire pickups, the names that you must know. So make sure to tune in. And in the meantime, if you guys enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe. Also, check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. Join our free newsletter for some exclusive content. Become a VIP for season-long fantasy advice from yours truly. And also, give us a follow on Twitter at alldaypigskin to continue interacting with us throughout the week. But with all that said, let's get right into it. Before getting into our breakdowns, we want to give you guys a quick word from our sponsors at Overlay Fantasy Sports, who are taking DFS to a whole nother level. And by now, you might have already heard us talk about their all-new matchup shop function, but that's because it's absolutely awesome. And we want to continue to shed some light on it, as we think it's absolutely unique, exciting, and we take advantage of it every single game day. And you should too, because betting on the same old Team A versus Team B game can get a little bit boring, a little bit stale. But looking at the matchup shop function at Overlay Fantasy Sports, it allows you to pick individual player matchups throughout pretty much any given game, not just through the NFL, because as you can see here, you can bet on golf, MLB, or even the NBA, but focusing specifically on the NFL. The betting here works the exact same way you used to it. You can look at specific spread picks in a single matchup between quarterbacks, running backs, tight ends. So for example here, if you think that Joe Burrow and Carson Wentz is an intriguing matchup like we do, with Carson Wentz getting +2, so if his overall fantasy scoring is within 2 points of Joe Burrow and you bet on Wentz, well, guess what? You are going to cash in. And like we said, don't worry, you can bet on not only quarterback matchups, you can look at wide receivers, Julio Jones or Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins or Will Fuller. There's some great matchups here, and just like a regular bet, add on to it. Get a little bit of a parlay action going and double your winnings. It's extremely exciting, extremely fun, and extremely easy to get into it. So take advantage of this. All that homework you guys are doing to benefit your fantasy lineups, well, let's have it benefit your wallet as well. So check out Overlay Fantasy Sports now. Starting at the quarterback position, we begin with Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals, who this last week versus the Eagles had 317 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. And now in week 4, we'll get the Jacksonville Jaguars, who were just carved up by Ryan Fitzpatrick. So the prospects for Burrow look good. And when you keep in mind that the rushing attack for the Bengals with Joe Mixon is struggling a little bit now, well, that even more so means more volume, more opportunities for Joe Burrow through the air. And with guys like Tyler Boyd, AJ Green, and Higgins, well, you have to like the upside here in a very friendly matchup. Next up, we've got Nick Foles of the Chicago Bears, and it was only a matter of time until we made this switch. And wouldn't you know it, it actually took place in week 3. That's why the numbers weren't all that great, but Foles versus the Falcons did have 188 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. And now, presumably being the starting quarterback, at least for the short term for the Bears, well, Nick Foles has a decent matchup in week 4 versus the Indianapolis Colts. And this offense with Nick Foles under center is a little bit better. Look, not by much, but a little bit. And you've still got some weapons there with Allen Robinson, with Miller, with David Montgomery, and maybe with a little bit of an improved Jimmy Graham. And this matchup isn't the worst, so we'd go ahead and roll the dice on Foles. Our third and final quarterback is Teddy Bridgewater of the Carolina Panthers, who this last week had 235 passing yards, 1 touchdown versus a relatively tough Chargers defense. And we get it, those stats aren't anything to write home about, and the Panthers are still without their best offensive playmaker in Christian McCaffrey. But on the other side of this, in week 4, the Panthers will be going up against the Arizona Cardinals, whose defense isn't all that great and couldn't really stop Matthew Stafford this last week. And again, we're not saying that Bridgewater and Stafford belong in the same conversation. Far from it, but this is an easier matchup. And we anticipate that someone like a DJ Moore, who is a viable weapon for the Panthers, will be more involved in week 4. This should be a higher scoring affair than what we saw versus the Chargers in week 3. So for that reason, Teddy Bridgewater could be a decent quarterback 2 type of prospect for week 4. Getting to our running back position, we begin with Carlos Hyde of the Seattle Seahawks. And maybe this name has a little bit of an asterisk next to it because even though Chris Carson did get injured versus the Dallas Cowboys, what's being called a knee sprain at this point in time, we don't necessarily know the severity. So if he does end up suiting up in week 4, then Carlos Hyde will fall off this list. But right now, especially when you consider that Seattle will be playing the Miami Dolphins in week 4, I would say that they probably play it a little bit more cautious and rest Chris Carson. So for that reason, if Carlos Hyde does play, I like him as a volume guy, especially in standard formats. I wouldn't really target him in PPR scoring because he doesn't really have that pass catching role, but he should get plenty of volume, close to potentially 20 rush attempts. We'll see. I don't think Russell Wilson will necessarily have to do all that much through the air. I could very well see the Seattle Seahawks putting up close to 30 points. So either way, there should be opportunities for Carlos Hyde in week 4 as long as he gets the start. Next up, we have got Jeff Wilson of the San Francisco 49ers, who this last week had 12 rush attempts for 15 yards and a touchdown, but then also 3 receptions for 54 yards and a receiving touchdown as well. And with the 49ers, as long as all these big name players are hurt, and specifically at the running back position, Coleman and Mostert are unavailable, well, it will continue to be the McKinnon and Wilson show. Yes, we do prefer McKinnon in this scenario, but Wilson isn't a bad 1B to McKinnon's 1A. Yes, they're both probably RB2s with Wilson having a lower floor, but it could be worse, and especially with so many wide receivers hurt at this point in time, pass catchers in general, Wilson does have some decent upside, and in a matchup versus the Philadelphia Eagles, we're not all that worried about it. We should say that the upside for Wilson will greatly increase if Jimmy Garoppolo returns. If he doesn't, it's a bit of a shakier start. Our third and final running back is Rex Burkhead of the New England Patriots, who had an absolute blow-up game in week 3 versus the Raiders. 6 rush attempts, 49 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, and then also 7 receptions for 49 yards and a pass-catching touchdown. Now, we should say, more than likely, this will be a blip when it comes to the season-long performance of Rex Burkhead. And again, there should be an asterisk next to his name here, because what happens if James White returns? He will, I believe, automatically regain that pass-catching role, and Rex Burkhead will be, lower down the food chain. So that's obviously what we have to keep an eye out for in this situation. But in a matchup versus the Kansas City Chiefs in week 4, well, the Patriots will need all the help they can get in terms of pass catchers, in terms of offensive weapons. So from that perspective, Rex Burkhead could be a decent flyer. Moving on to our wide receivers, this is where we have the most options for week 4 waivers. And we begin with Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, who this last week had 7 receptions, 175 receiving yards, and 1 touchdown. Outplayed Adam Thielen in every aspect of that contest. And even though Justin Jefferson is a rookie, we finally saw the Minnesota Vikings go ahead and give him the green light, because up until last week, it was the Olabisi Johnson option preferred at the wide receiver 2 spot, but it sure seems like Justin Jefferson has become the clear-cut number 2 guy, especially after his performance. Now, I wouldn't be looking for that type of repeat performance week in and week out, because Adam Thielen won't have as pedestrian of a stat line every single week. Dalvin Cook will continue to do his thing, and other pass catchers will also be involved. But it's a very nice sign to see Justin Jefferson now fully be that wide receiver 2, it seems like, in this offense, and that does bring value. It sure seems like he has the highest upside out of all of these rookie wide receivers, and a matchup in week 4 versus the Houston Texans isn't all that bad. Next, we've got Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers, who had a rushing touchdown along with 5 receptions for 70 yards in week 3. And this is, again, a continuation of there's so many injured players for the 49ers offensively, and pass catchers. Brandon Aiyuk might be the best option. Now, I would mention that you have to keep an eye out for the return of Deebo Samuel and when that will happen, because whenever that occurs, then the ceiling for Aiyuk will go down. But in the meantime, a contest in week 4 versus the Philadelphia Eagles isn't all that bad. And obviously, the upside is bigger for Aiyuk once Jimmy Garoppolo returns as well. Next up, we've got Braxton Berrios of the New York Jets, who had 4 receptions for 64 yards and a touchdown this last week. And I get it, trusting a New York Jet isn't all that great, but on a short week where Jamison Crowder and Brashad Perriman might not be able to suit up again, that could translate to a lot of volume for Berrios. And it sure seems like he was that most trusted next up wide receiver for Sam Darnold. And again, it won't be pretty for Berrios, but if the volume is there and if Crowder and Perriman both sit out, then I wouldn't mind taking a flyer on him in week 4. Continuing on, we've got Cole Beasley of the Buffalo Bills, who this last week had 6 receptions for 100 yards versus a relatively tough defense in the LA Rams. And the reason we're including Beasley here is twofold. Not only because Josh Allen is absolutely balling out right now, but more importantly, John Brown got nicked up in that contest versus the Rams. We don't quite know the severity of that injury, but if he can't suit up for week 4 versus a friendly matchup in the Las Vegas Raiders, then Cole Beasley is someone that we would definitely be targeting, because after Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley is that next option, and we have seen what John Brown can do opposite of Diggs and have some relative success leading up to week 3. So for that reason, Cole Beasley, if John Brown sits, is a great option. Our final wide receiver on this list is Greg Ward of the Philadelphia Eagles, who had 8 receptions for 72 yards and a touchdown this last week. And all of a sudden, we've gotten into Greg Ward season yet again for the Eagles. It happened a lot later in the season last year, but now yet again, we are here because, well, Dallas Goedert got injured, Deshaun Jackson's banged up, and we don't know the status of Alshon Jeffery quite yet. So that means that Greg Ward could potentially be the number 1 wide receiver for the Philadelphia Eagles entering week 4. Yes, the matchup versus the 49ers isn't ideal, but I do think Carson Wentz can still deliver some opportunities for Greg Ward. And also, briefly wanting to mention, with Alshon Jeffery, once he does return, and it sure seems like it's getting closer and closer, he will probably be the preferred option in this Philadelphia passing attack. So for that reason, if he's still available off of waivers, even if you might be getting him a week early, we would also go ahead and put in a waiver wire bid for Alshon Jeffery. Looking at our tight ends next, we start with Jimmy Graham of the Chicago Bears, who this last week had 6 receptions for 60 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, yes, obviously those 2 touchdowns make that stat line a lot better, but the upside for Jimmy Graham is also higher with Nick Foles under center. And a matchup, like we said before, versus the Indianapolis Colts isn't all that scary. So with Jimmy Graham being a red zone option, you have to like the upside a little bit from that perspective. We don't anticipate a stat line like this every single week, but Jimmy Graham is obviously the preferred tight end option for the Chicago Bears and an offense where the tight end position is relatively important. Our second and final tight end is Eric Ebron of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who this last week had 5 receptions for 52 yards and 1 touchdown. And it sure seems like Eric Ebron is the preferred tight end in Pittsburgh, and especially with Deontay Johnson dealing with a concussion. If he does not suit up in a matchup versus the Titans in week 4, who just gave up a boatload of points to the Minnesota Vikings, then Eric Ebron is not a bad streaming option at the tight end position. I would say after Juju Smith-Schuster on that offense without Deontay Johnson, Eric Ebron is probably the second most preferred target for Big Ben, which means a lot of opportunities. And finally, getting to our defenses, we begin with the Denver Broncos, because every single year there's a team that you always want to stream a defense against, and this year it sure seems to be the New York Jets, and that's exactly who the Denver Broncos are facing in week 4. Look, on a short week where the Jets are really banged up offensively, you have to like the Denver Broncos here. There's not much else to say, but Sam Darnold is an absolute turnover machine. There's no one offensively that really scares us. Yes, there might be volume, but all in all, we think the Denver Broncos have a great matchup in week 4. Next, we've got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who will be facing the LA Chargers in week 4. And you like the upside here, especially with the Bucs coming off a relatively solid performance versus the Denver Broncos. Now they face a rookie in Justin Herbert, who even though had some big plays versus the Carolina Panthers, who have an absolutely awful defense, Well, not all that many points were scored. Now the Bucs were a relatively better core defensively and a better offense as well that will force Justin Herbert probably to play catch up more of that game. We like this matchup yet again for the Bucs in week 4. Our third and final defense is the LA Rams, who in week 4 will be facing the New York Giants, who absolutely got pummeled by a injury-riddled San Francisco 49ers defense. So now versus the LA Rams, who have still got Aaron Donald and Jalen Ramsey on that team and some good ball hawks, well, we like the matchup here because if last week was any indication for what life after Saquon Barkley might be for the Giants, then you might have to start considering streaming opposing defenses versus the Giants. Yes, I do expect a bounce back effort from the Giants, but I don't see them scoring all that many points. Keep in mind, Sterling Shepard also dealing with a turf toe injury, so the Rams have a pretty good matchup. So with that, we wrap up our week 4 waiver wire pickups. And as always, let us hear it in the comment section. Did you agree? Did you disagree? Were there some names that we left off? Let us hear it along with any other fantasy questions you guys might have. And as always, if you guys enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. Also, check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. Join our free newsletter for some exclusive content. Become a VIP and get personalized fantasy advice for the rest of the season from yours truly. And also give us a follow on Twitter at alldaypigskin to continue interacting with us throughout the week. But in the meantime, we'll see you guys in future videos.